All right, your brave souls, thank you. We are literally the last content of the day, and I apologize for the scheduling error that puts us here at 7 o'clock while everybody else is setting up and getting ready to have beer and music, but hopefully this is intriguing enough to get you motivated around data science. What I want to tell you, though, most importantly about this is a crap ton of content that I have squeezed into what is supposed to be 25, maybe at best 30 minutes. So I'm going to fly. If I do something fast that you're interested in, you're intrigued, I want you to recognize I'll give you the deck. It's all public, and I'll give you the longer version as well, because this is actually an hour-long conversation squeezed in. So I have the pleasure of operating a fantastic blue team at Microsoft, and one of our core challenges, as you will learn, and one of our goals around solutions here is managing extremely large data sets. Without information and organization, it is literally impossible. So one of the angles we've taken is taking a look at ways to overcome huge data volumes, huge incident volumes, huge increases in the amount of security alerts literally going up exponentially each and every year just because of the volume of services as well as the volume of attacks. So for us, it really is not mathematically possible to hire the problem away. We have to get pretty slick around our solutions. And one of the ways we do that is using R in a couple of different capabilities. One of the things that's cool here is the fact that there is some positive growth. Folks are beginning to build more in-house detections, more in-house capabilities, and amongst them are methods just like this that will help you overcome some of the obstacles around things like simple atomic detections. I propose that you want to learn how to operate at scale, and one of the ways we do that is with various algorithms. So if you're interested and you're looking for the best way to get started in this very premise, this is a fantastic book. Jay Jacobs, Bob Rudis, both tweet rather prolifically. They have fantastic blogs. And in essence, this is what is your guidepost. Consider this your Bible. This is a fantastic book. It includes a ton of Python as well. They share all their code samples, and it is literally gold for those of you who want to get in this space and start learning quickly. The beauty about R is that you don't have to be a sophisticated programmer. You don't have to be a statistician. You don't have to be a data scientist. It certainly helps, and you can leverage it far better. But one of the beauties of it is simply well packaged and well supported. And there are tons of ways to connect to data, APIs, database connections, etc. And again, I don't consider myself by any means a data scientist or a statistician. I am an analyst at heart. My team are analysts at heart. And in essence, I think that those of you who are brave enough to be in this room at this late hour would agree that you're probably not expert programmers, data scientists, or statisticians, and yet you'd probably like to be able to take advantage of these features. R does give you that opportunity. So with that, I've put scenarios together for you because I want this to sort of be applicable in essence real time in ways that we would use it in real world cases. As we get down to what might be the sentiment analysis, I will tell you that this is a faux set of attackers. I can't actually disclose to you real attackers we've had, but you go get the principles in essence. We'll start with malicious event ID or process sequences. For me, when you look at a bunch of data and somebody ships a spreadsheet to you or just pops a single alert and it's a bunch of text, I don't find that very compelling as an analyst. And one of the goals that we're trying to take our data science program to and our logging capabilities is what does it look like at a visual layer for an analyst? Sure, you can pop an alert, but can they dig into data that they can actually drill into when it's properly visualized? R is beautiful for this, and you can plug R into things like Power BI now and even Shiny dashboards and get interactivity with the R data so you can drill right to source. There's a fantastic paper out there called Intrusion Detection Using Indicators of Compromise based on best practices in Windows event logs. And it proposes that you get sequences. And with them, obviously, you can visualize those sequences. One of the packages in R that really helps you do this is Treminer, Trajectory Miner for R. It's really focused on what you consider the social sciences and psychology, but principally, it's amazing how much event sequencing works the same way. I'll give you a quick visualization of that as represented in the paper. You have ultimately that Peter's account failed to log on, Peter's account successfully logged on, special privileges were assigned, and then depending on your attack chain, any number of possibilities occurred. Jamie's account was created, etc., etc. Each of those obviously maps to an event ID. Principally, this is oversimplified because how you capture and build detections on the sequence of event IDs over time matters. Is this going to happen immediately followed by this? No. There's some sense of how you balance how quickly each of these events fire, but if you master that based on a learning process, you'll begin to get a proper timing sequence, which then allows you to visualize this. But here's the beauty of the code, and I promise this isn't overly text heavy, but if you build your format of the data events properly, and this is the sequence it needs to be to read into the code, the reality is that is the entire amount of code necessary to create a visualization from it that gives you really nice event sequencing. And to that end, it will run for you. This is our studio, by the way. It's free. It's an easily available IDE for playing with R. And again, if you reach out to me, I will give you all of this information. I'll give you cards at the end. But it takes our event ID sequences and fires them in order. And what you basically have is shorter sequences starting with 4625 on the inner rings and building out. From an analyst perspective, if he sees a longer chain and also maps it up against other numbers, the ability to drill in then, because again, this is literally JavaScript and HTML on the front end from a viewer perspective when deployed in a dashboard, lets them drill right into the data. And you should only represent in this what is known to be signature matches or detection matches against what you think are malicious chains based on the IOCs. So, it's an oversimplification, but I am finding that it is beginning to make analyst lives better. Moving very quickly. Sentiment analysis. I have found that there are a couple of opportunities to utilize this when, in particular, folks are very busy on social media. And I'll describe the scenarios. But there are fantastic packages in R that let you interact directly with the Twitter API. You do need an account. Obviously, there's a 4-sequence OAuth process you have to build out into the code, but it's very simple and it's well documented. And in so doing, you can make use of the API. It does get throttled, so don't hammer it too much, but you can pull a lot of data back, particularly if you use a narrow search because you think you've got it pinned to 1,000 possible tweets in a given timeline. We have a small gaming platform at Microsoft that some folks like to take advantage of around Christmas time. And as you can imagine, a few years ago it was popular with attackers as well. So imagine that scenario as we walk through this. These are not real attacker names, but the process we discovered in that group and subsequent groups after it is that because they're young and not particularly solid on OPSEC, they spend a lot of time on Twitter talking about their exploits. And you can learn quite a bit of them through the Twitter API. So in this scenario, though, we walk through what is a DDoS news cycle from something that was actually very real and just occurred in August, which was the WireX botnet. A bunch of Android mobile devices got popped, and then we're hammering away in terms of an extortion campaign for DDoS. Ultimately, the tags that were most popular and used all the time in this discussion in the media, as per bloggers and writers, if you will, was DDoS, Android, and WireX. So if you just take the 3 hashtags in particular and apply them to just a tiny little bit of code, I intentionally did not spray this all over the place so you can read it, but I just want you to know that's about 10 lines of code total, including comments, that renders in, I think, a very useful visualization. Number 1, tweets by day. When you get a sense of what the volumes are, this is the source tweet, and then everything in blue is in essence retweeted. You get the area of interest, right? So if you have a spike here, it's possible that particularly if you're analyzing attackers or hashtags related to your attack, you can map that directly to what would be a spike in traffic for your service that's being hammered as well. And consequently, you can begin to see ultimately what times of day are interesting. And of course, lots and lots of retweets around lunchtime Pacific is potentially interesting. In the evening as well, around 9. So it does let you build some patterns for behavior, and it does in fact match up occasionally to what the attackers are following in the way of when they're calling out an attack. And these guys literally talk to each other on Twitter to do it. When we talk about emotional balance, it's the balance on either side of emotional neutrality. And it's a psychological term or psychology term, but it applies in the Twitter sphere, because basically it's how much over 0 is it positive or how much over 0 is it negative. And that is to say, I feel very positively, or I'm an attacker, kill, nuke. You know, people start talking in really negative terms. So when you use balance, it's actually quite fascinating that the same message can be conveyed in a very different manner. This is basically the most positive one, and it sounds like a rah-rah, right? A bunch of internet tech companies had to work together to clean up the botnet. Super nice. Same message, different language. Dangerous WireX Android DDoS botnet killed by security giants. Exactly the same thing, but totally different balance. This helps you measure, in essence, the sentiment of what might be your attacker. You can further visualize this as well. Over time of day, again, if I talk to you about emotional neutrality here at the 0 line, anything over is positive. That most positive tweets sitting right here visually. The most negative tweet, obviously, sitting down there visually. So you begin to see, obviously, attitude gets worse as the day goes longer, right? How about happier tweets getting retweeted more often? The short answer is, this is your neutrality, your 0 marker. There's only a couple of positive tweets over here, and then a ton of traffic on this side. So obviously, the negative amount of data in this case was retweeted. And again, this is the amount of R code necessary to lift that out of that data set once you've pulled it via the Twitter API. So quite useful and incredibly fast and small amount of code to get it. And this is basically a representation, again, minimalist code, of the words that were positive, and you saw it in that one tweet, work good, clean, nice. The rest of this is extremely negative. And I have found in other scenarios, as we talk about actual attackers versus just bloggers talking about a thing, that some of these attack words really came in and helped rather specifically zooming in on particular individuals who were complicit, shall we say. You can really focus on who's retweeting who and who is mentioning who. You're not necessarily supposed to be able to see this, but you get a huge sense of the retweet network. The larger the network node is, obviously it begins to match up, and you can begin to see patterns there. Who's talking about who, who's mentioning who in attacks, and gather clusters of interested in each other individuals, and they'll often join each other in their communications. But most importantly, how do you translate that into something actionable? And that's geolocation. So again, we're just working on bloggers here. One of the most busy, prolific bloggers as seen here is HackRead. That's that bigger network node there. So focusing on that, knowing that they were in Milan, Italy, I imagined, if I would, the same concept of what if they were attackers and I was trying to geolocate them. The reality is I can punch in nodes within 5 miles, within the date range of what is the spike of tweets, as we saw in that very first chart, based on the highest level of tweeters. What did I get out of it? I got 4 tweets, 4 particular individuals, nailed down by their handles, and the reality is very quickly we learned that the tool works pretty well, pins everybody in Milan. So if you're ultimately actually trying to locate what you think might be the location of attackers, this can be extremely useful. And people don't realize that Twitter actually reveals this. It's right there in the API. So, moving quickly. Decision trees. Logistic regression versus fast and frugal trees. I'm a big fan of decision trees because you basically need 1 to 5 possible inputs to make an interesting decision out of data versus having to run, I don't even know. I don't want to talk about logistic regression because literally I can't. This individual who created this package, though, is in fact a psychologist and statistician. As is often the case, these PhDs create incredible tools, but they are applicable to us in information security. One of the things that's fascinating, though, and Gladwell points out, we often think in terms of how much time we spend on making a decision. And the fact is, oh, I spent hours and hours laboring over this, and thus it's a better decision. That's not necessarily true. I don't know about you guys, but as a scenario, I thought I'd use CVSS data. Folks are often immediately glaze over and get the grumpy look when we talk about CVSS. I get it, and I understand. Nor am I a fan, because there's such a ton of complexity and subjectivity in how people gather CVSS scores. And the reality is, you're at the benefit, or shall we say, the mercy of the risk assessor who's trying to create something beneficial for you, but the truth is, what if that person's wrong and the subjectivity of that analysis is not very sound? So you get raw data, and of course, base impact, exploitability, temporal, environmental, modified impact, and overall are the common triggers that you might look for. But this very, very short package use in R and 3 to 4 lines of code, again, lets you run it right through some decision trees instead of trusting that everything that risk assessor said was solid. The reality is, and this is a tiny little bit of statistics, if you will, measuring the quality of data before you run it through a tree. It wants to look for cues, and it likes to be what they call an area over the curve. I'm sorry, under the curve. This is your rock. This is the area represents over the curve. You don't want to be under the curve here. The reality is you want to be as close to 1 as possible. What the model landed on very quickly, which makes a ton of sense, is it likes 1 and 2 the most, which are impact and exploitability. And if you think about it, that's obviously the thing that probably matters the most to us as well if we're assessing data. I do care most about how easily exploited is it and what's the impact of my business. The model landed on that itself, which is fantastic. Walking you through this very quickly, 683 total data points with a decision to be made around which was critical and which was non-critical. It was split by the assessor based on that, in essence, table I showed you, 444 non-critical, 239. But the tree, based on its modeling of anything less than or more than 2 on impact and exploitability, came up with some very different answers. And the short answer is 406 non-critical, 222. If you're actually applying cost analysis, how much work you have to do in order to overcome these critical vulnerabilities post-breach, that actually matters. You are focusing actually on less critical events. Now, some statisticians would say, yes, you have a nice performance fitting here. That's super cool because you're in the 90s, which means this of the 6 possible trees is the best one. But some people don't like it because there's still some premise that there might be 20 false positives in there. You can actually run through each of the models individually. And this one applies differently. It took the impact and exploitability, but also factored for environmental and modified impact. Far fewer false positives, but then it definitely seemed to have a slightly different answer in the amount of non-critical versus critical. So you have to decide what premise ultimately works best for you. I will tell you that looking at the data itself, the best match was the one that the model discovered based on the cues around impact and exploitability. So, here's another one. And we're actually doing really well, so that's good. I'll slow down a little bit here in time series regressions. The thing I hate the most as an analyst, running a team of analysts and faced with a great deal of data, is what we call atomic alerts. Basically, you might get something of 4624 in a particularly high-value environment. And the short answer is, if you really want an analyst getting on the phone going, did you log on? Did you log on? Did you log on? Was that you? Was that you? That's not an effective use of their time. What if the model can validate when there's an outlier, when there's something a little different about who and when somebody logged on? And imagine, too, that you can do that across a massive body of data. I will use a model here that is just 1 user, but you can do this with 1,000 users in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. Ultimately, time series regression was first used financially, both for projecting sales growth and modeling and forecasting of economic models, but it works beautifully in the security space. This is an example user with what we derive as actual data, and it's just a date with the number of logons, successful 4624s with event ID type 10. Type 10, of course, is remote interactive. And this is obviously normal traffic in most environments. If you're looking at it over a period of 90 days, you begin to get an interesting data set that the model can look back on and imply what we call seasonality. With 90 days of data, you can begin to get what are some normal patterns for a given user. So it in essence learns, based on the repetition in that period, what's fairly standard. And if that user account makes some changes in the environment, does something a little different, the model pops, because basically you're outside the expected interval. Confidence intervals. Eric, one of our data scientists, wrote this in 200 total lines of code for R, and it actually includes 2 models for TSR, which gives you a slightly different result. But when we talk about the seasonality and the smoothing, triple exponential smoothing, the reality is it's pretty consistent. This is the confidence within 95% that you're okay. So the darker gray is 95%. Out here is 99%. So you see that the guy's patterns, these are logging counts over time. This is the seasonal norm. A little less on this day, a little more on that day. On average, everything's cool right up until August 27th. Wham, he goes off the charts. And you can see, as represented in the data, he went over 20, the threshold. Anything over threshold of 19 fires an exception. You get the visualization and you get an alert back to your SOC analyst. And again, you're doing this over 90 plus days of data that you're constantly processing against in a rolling manner. And you're doing this with all your users. It becomes incredibly useful. So, we flew. That is it. I heartily recommend that you take on some of these tactics. What I didn't share with you is ultimately other APIs that you can make use of to gather data for users on things like, the Have I Been Pwned site that Troy Hunt offers. There's a fantastic little API that he offers for absolutely free. You can run very simple R that will then format the output in both easily ingested CSV and or HTML format, rather than just having to punch names into what are a website. That's annoying. If you have 1,000 users, look who was part of the Equifax nightmare, right? That's the kind of data you want to be checking for via something like Have I Been Pwned. So R and Python are really well and broadly supported for this mission, but do add elements of data science and particularly visualization through R as you think about this in your environments. And with that, in just a couple minutes, questions, again, I'll give you a card if you want this data. I've got the longer deck for you as well, so I'll share it gladly. But there we are, done at 20. Sir?
You wanted to come up with a baseline in an IR gauge for their environment. However, there is a possibility that there's an threat actor within that environment. How do you make sure that this threat actor activity does not harm your model?
It's a great question, and the first thing my red team said to me when I presented this idea and set of ideas is they're like, we're going to load you with false flags. We're going to absolutely drop things that will confuse your model and or have it learn inappropriately. So the short answer is you're going to face that challenge, and it's not. What we're trying to do is model on models and or model on complex detection, so that it's not just one model you're drawing from. Can you use this model coupled with Markov chains around related processes as those processes execute, firing from that same user who's triggering that original event in the time series? So you have to add complexity to the way you're modeling, and hopefully you can get some true marker against what could in fact be manipulated data. That was the first thing out of my thought. We're going to screw with your data. It's like, okay, great, awesome. Good? Truly, thank you for coming at this late hour. I appreciate it. And cards here if you guys want. I'll send you.